The handcuffs clicked around my wrists as I stood in my own driveway, surrounded by flashing red and blue lights. My neighbors watched from their windows as Sheriff Karen smirked and shoved me toward her patrol car. The moving truck sat half-empty behind us, my belongings scattered across the gravel like evidence of some crime I never committed. "You picked the wrong house to rob today," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. I looked at the deed in my hand, then at her badge, then at the woman who had just turned my dream into a nightmare. That was the moment I realized that owning the land would not be enough. I would have to fight for the right to live on it. After 37 years of city life, I finally had enough money saved to buy my dream. A small ranch in Montana, complete with rolling hills and a creek that ran clear as glass through the back pasture. I had spent months searching online listings, driving hundreds of miles to look at properties that never quite felt right. But this place was different. The moment I stepped out of my car and breathed that clean mountain air, I knew I was home. The house was modest but sturdy, with a wraparound porch that overlooked 23 acres of the most beautiful land I had ever seen. The previous owner, an elderly man named Frank, had maintained it well. His handshake was firm when we signed the papers. "You are going to love it here," he said, handing me the keys. "Quiet neighbors, good people, just the kind of place to start fresh." The closing process took 3 weeks. I remember sitting in that lawyer's office, signing document after document, my hand trembling with excitement. When the notary stamped the final paper, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I had been carrying for years. This was mine. Every fence post, every blade of grass, every sunset over those hills belonged to me. Moving day arrived on a Tuesday in early September. I had hired a professional moving company, and their big truck rumbled up the gravel driveway at exactly 8 in the morning. The crew was friendly and efficient, carefully unloading boxes marked kitchen and bedroom and garage. I directed them where to place my furniture, feeling proud and accomplished with every piece that found its place in my new home. The morning air was crisp and clean. Birds sang in the old oak tree near the front porch. I could hear the creek babbling in the distance, and somewhere far off, cattle lowing in a neighboring pasture. This was peace. This was everything I had worked for, saved for, dreamed about during all those years in the city. I was helping the movers carry my grandmother's antique dresser when I heard the car door slam. The sound was harsh and aggressive, cutting through the peaceful morning like a knife. I looked up to see a patrol car parked at the end of my driveway, and a woman in a sheriff's uniform walking toward us with purpose in her stride. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with short gray hair and eyes that seemed to look for trouble everywhere they landed. Her uniform was crisp and pressed, her badge polished to a shine. But there was something in her expression that made my stomach clench with unease. "Good morning, officer," I called out, setting down my end of the dresser. "Beautiful day, is it not?" She did not return my greeting. Instead, she looked at the moving truck, then at me, then at the boxes scattered around my front yard. Her hand rested on her radio, and I could see her jaw working like she was chewing on something bitter. "We got a call about suspicious activity," she said. "Someone reported seeing strangers loading and unloading items from this property." I felt my heart skip a beat, but I kept my voice calm and friendly. "Oh, that would be me. I just bought this place. I am moving in today." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes narrow and calculating. "Is that so?" The sheriff stepped closer, and I could see the nameplate on her uniform, KDAVIDSON. She looked me up and down like I was some kind of specimen under a microscope, her expression growing more suspicious by the second. "You got any proof of that?" she asked, her voice sharp with authority. I blinked, confused by the hostility in her tone. Proof? Well, yes, of course. I have the deed right here in my. Nobody moves into a house without giving the neighbors notice, she interrupted. Nobody just shows up with a moving truck and starts unloading boxes without talking to the community first. The moving crew had stopped working and were watching our conversation with uncomfortable expressions. I could feel their eyes on me, and I realized how this must look to them. Here I was, being questioned by the sheriff on what should have been the happiest day of my life. "I am sorry, officer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I did not realize there was a protocol for moving into your own home. This is my property. I bought it fair and square." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your property? You got paperwork for that claim?" "Yes, I do." I walked over to my car and retrieved the folder containing all my closing documents. My hands were shaking slightly as I pulled out the deed and handed it to her. "Here. This shows that I am the legal owner of this property as of last month." Sheriff Davidson took the papers and examined them with exaggerated care, holding them up to the light like she was looking for forgeries. She studied every line, every signature, every official seal. The whole time, she kept glancing at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "Frank Morrison sold this place to you?" she asked finally. "Yes, that is correct. Mr. Morrison and I completed the sale 3 weeks ago." Frank never mentioned anything about selling to some out-of-state buyer. I felt a flash of irritation. I am not required to get permission from Frank Morrison or anyone else to buy property in this county. The sale was legal and properly recorded. "Watch your tone with me," she snapped, stepping closer. "I am the law in this county, and I do not appreciate attitude from people I do not know." The moving crew was openly starring now, and I could see neighbors starting to gather at their windows and front porches. What should have been a private conversation was becoming a public spectacle, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment. "I am not giving you attitude," I said quietly. "I am simply trying to move into my home. Is there a problem with that?" Sheriff Davidson handed me back the deed, but her expression had not softened. There is always a problem when strangers show up in our community without proper introduction. We like to know who we are dealing with around here. "I understand that and I respect it, but I am not a stranger anymore. I live here now. This is my home." She looked at the moving truck again, then at the boxes on my lawn, then back at me. "We will see about that," she said. "I am going to need to verify these documents, make sure everything is legitimate." "Verify them with whom?" "With the county clerk, with the real estate office, with Frank Morrison himself if I have to." She pulled out her radio and keyed the microphone. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Davidson. I need backup at the Morrison property on County Road 47. Possible breaking and entering in progress." My heart stopped. "Breaking and entering? Are you serious? I just showed you the deed." "Anyone can forge paperwork," she said with a shrug. "Until I can verify your story, I am treating this as a potential crime scene." The sound of additional sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. I stood there in my own driveway, holding the deed to my own property, watching my dream morning turn into a nightmare. The moving crew was backing away from the truck, clearly wanting no part of whatever was happening. "This is insane," I whispered, but Sheriff Davidson was already walking back toward her patrol car, speaking into her radio with obvious satisfaction. 3 more patrol cars arrived within minutes, their sirens wailing and lights flashing like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. Deputies poured out of the vehicles, hands resting on their weapons, treating my peaceful moving day like a raid on a drug house. Sheriff Davidson stood in the center of it all, directing her officers with the authority of someone who clearly enjoyed the power. She pointed at me, then at the moving truck, then at my scattered belongings, giving orders in a voice loud enough for the growing crowd of neighbors to hear. "Secure the perimeter," she commanded. "Nobody touches anything until we can verify ownership." The head of the moving crew, a kind man named Tony, approached me with an apologetic expression. "Look, I am sorry about this, but we cannot continue working until this gets sorted out. We do not want to get involved in any legal issues." "There are no legal issues," I said, my voice rising with frustration. "This is my house. I have the deed right here." "Sir, I need to see some identification," one of the deputies said, stepping forward with his hand extended. I pulled out my driver's license and handed it over, feeling like I was surrendering my dignity along with it. The deputy examined it carefully, then walked over to confer with Sheriff Davidson in hushed tones. More neighbors had gathered now, standing at the edges of their yards and whispering among themselves. I could see them pointing at me, shaking their heads, probably wondering what kind of criminal had moved into their quiet community. The shame burned in my chest like acid. "Mr. Johnson," Sheriff Davidson called out, using my name like it was something distasteful. "You claim to have purchased this property from Frank Morrison. When exactly did this alleged transaction take place?" "3 weeks ago," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "On August 15th, at the law office of Martinez and Associates in town." "And you have documentation of this purchase?" "I already showed you the deed." "I need to see more than that. Purchase agreement, closing statement, title insurance, bank records showing the transfer of funds." I stared at her in disbelief. "All of that is private financial information. I am not required to share it with you. You are if you want to avoid being arrested for trespassing and theft." The words hit me like a physical blow. Arrested for moving into my own home. For moving into a home you may or may not have the legal right to occupy. She stepped closer, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. "See, we have had problems with squatters in this county. People who forge documents, make up stories about buying property, then move in and try to establish residency. It is a real problem. I am not a squatter. I have legitimate documentation." "So you say, but until I can verify that with the appropriate authorities, I am treating this as a potential crime." She turned to one of her deputies. "Rodriguez, call the county clerk's office. See if they have any record of a property transfer for this address." "Yes, ma'am." "And call Frank Morrison. Get him down here to verify whether he actually sold this place to this individual." I felt my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "This is harassment. You have no right to treat me like a criminal when I have done nothing wrong." "I have every right to investigate suspicious activity in my county," she replied. "And frankly, your attitude is making me even more suspicious." One of the neighbors, an elderly woman with silver hair, had walked close enough to hear our conversation. "Sheriff Davidson," she called out, "is everything all right? Should we be concerned?" "Nothing to worry about, Mrs. Patterson," the sheriff replied in a voice that was suddenly warm and reassuring. "Just making sure our community stays safe. You know how it is with all these outsiders trying to take advantage of good people." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly and shot me a look that was pure suspicion. "Well, we certainly appreciate you looking out for us, Sheriff." "Always happy to serve." I watched this exchange with growing anger and disbelief. Sheriff Davidson was playing to the crowd, positioning herself as the protector of the community and me as the threat. And it was working. I could see it in the faces of my new neighbors, the way they looked at me like I was some kind of con artist or worse. "How long is this going to take?" I asked, my voice tight with controlled frustration. "As long as it takes," she replied with a shrug. "Justice cannot be rushed." The verification process took 4 hours. 4 hours of standing in my own driveway while Sheriff Davidson and her deputies treated me like a suspect. 4 hours of watching my neighbors whisper and point and judge. 4 hours of having my character questioned and my integrity challenged. When Frank Morrison finally arrived, looking confused and slightly irritated, he confirmed what I had been saying all along. "Of course I sold the place to him," Frank said, looking at Sheriff Davidson like she had lost her mind. "We closed 3 weeks ago. What is this all about?" "Just doing my due diligence, Frank," she replied, but I could see the disappointment in her expression. "We cannot be too careful these days." "This is ridiculous, Karen," Frank said, shaking his head. "This man is the legitimate owner of this property. You had no right to put him through this." Sheriff Davidson's jaw tightened. "I had every right to investigate suspicious activity. Better safe than sorry." Frank looked at me with genuine sympathy. "I am sorry about this. Sheriff Davidson can be thorough sometimes." "Thorough," I repeated, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Is that what you call it?" After the deputies left and the moving crew reluctantly resumed their work, I found myself alone with Frank in my kitchen. He seemed embarrassed by the whole incident, and I could tell he wanted to say something but was struggling with how to begin. "Look," he said finally, "I probably should have warned you about Karen Davidson. She has been sheriff here for 8 years and well, she likes to run a tight ship." "A tight ship. She treated me like a criminal." Frank sighed heavily. "You are not the first person to have trouble with her. Karen has very strong opinions about who belongs in this community and who does not." "What do you mean?" "She does not like outsiders. Never has. Especially people from back east or the cities. She thinks they come here to change things, to disrupt the way of life we have built." I felt a chill run down my spine. So this was not really about verifying my ownership of the property. "No," Frank admitted. "This was about Karen letting you know that she is watching you, that she is in charge here and you better not forget it." Over the next few days, as I tried to settle into my new home, I began to hear stories. The cashier at the grocery store mentioned how Sheriff Davidson had pulled over a family from California 6 times in their first month, always finding some minor violation to cite them for. The man at the hardware store told me about a couple from Denver who had been harassed so relentlessly that they eventually sold their property and moved away. "She runs people out of town," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "People who do not fit her idea of what this community should be." I met Sarah Chen at the post office, a software engineer who had moved here from Seattle 2 years earlier. She looked tired and stressed, and when I mentioned my experience with Sheriff Davidson, her expression darkened. "She pulled me over 17 times in my first year," Sarah said. 17 times, always for nothing. A taillight that was supposedly out but worked fine. Speeding when I was going exactly the speed limit. Suspicious behavior for driving through my own neighborhood. "Did you file a complaint?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "With whom, her boss, she is elected, the city council, half of them are her friends, the state police. They told me it was a local matter." "So she just gets away with it." "She has been getting away with it for years. Karen Davidson is untouchable in this county. People are afraid of her." That night, lying in my new bed and listening to the peaceful sounds of the countryside, I made a decision. I had worked too hard and saved too long to let some small-town bully drive me away from my dream. If Sheriff Davidson wanted a fight, she would get one. I started keeping a journal. Every interaction with law enforcement, every time I saw a patrol car slow down as it passed my house, every conversation with neighbors about Sheriff Davidson's behavior. I documented everything with dates, times, and witnesses when possible. The pattern became clear quickly. Sheriff Davidson was not just harassing me. She was systematically targeting anyone she perceived as an outsider or threat to her vision of community control. Her methods were subtle but effective, designed to make people feel unwelcome without crossing obvious legal lines. I spent hours at the county courthouse, researching public records and studying the law. I learned about civil rights violations, harassment, and abuse of power. I read case studies of other small-town sheriffs who had overstepped their authority and faced consequences. Most importantly, I learned that documentation was everything. Sarah Chen became my first ally. She had been keeping her own records of harassment, and together we began to see the full scope of Sheriff Davidson's misconduct. There were at least a dozen families who had been targeted over the past 5 years. "We need to find the others," Sarah said during one of our meetings at the local diner. "People are scared to speak up individually, but if we present a united front, they might be willing to come forward," I finished. We started carefully. Conversations in grocery store aisles, casual meetings at community events, phone calls to people who had left town. Slowly, a picture emerged of systematic intimidation and abuse of power. Maria Santos, a teacher from Phoenix, had been pulled over so frequently that she started taking different routes to work every day. The Hendersons, a retired couple from Illinois, had been cited for property violations that other longtime residents routinely ignored. James Wright, a young veteran from Detroit, had been arrested twice on charges that were later dropped, but not before he lost his job and his reputation. "She destroys people," Maria told me during a quiet conversation at the library. "She finds your weakness and exploits it until you either submit or leave." I contacted a lawyer in the state capitol, a woman named Rebecca Torres who specialized in civil rights cases. She listened to my story with professional interest, asking detailed questions about specific incidents and documentation. "You have the beginning of a case," she said finally, "but you need more. You need to establish a clear pattern of discrimination and harassment that violates federal civil rights laws." "What kind of evidence do you need?" "Witness statements, police reports, documentation of selective enforcement, proof of discriminatory intent. It is not enough to show that she treated you badly. You have to prove that she treated you badly because of your status as an outsider." Over the next several weeks, I worked methodically to build that case. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for police reports and citation records. I interviewed victims and witnesses. I researched Sheriff Davidson's background and discovered a history of complaints that had been dismissed or ignored by local authorities. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Sheriff Davidson had been using her personal social media accounts to make disparaging comments about city folks and outsiders who were ruining our community. She had been careless, posting publicly about her encounters with people she considered undesirable. "This is gold," Rebecca told me when I showed her the screenshots. "She is essentially admitting to discriminatory intent in her own words." But building the case was only half the battle. The real challenge would be finding the courage to confront someone who had been abusing her power for years, someone who had successfully intimidated an entire community into silence. "Are you ready for this?" Rebecca asked me during our final preparation meeting. "Once we file these complaints, there is no going back. She is going to fight, and she is going to make your life miserable in the process." I thought about my dream ranch, about the peace I had hoped to find, about all the other people who had been driven away by fear and intimidation. "I am ready," I said. The formal complaint was filed on a Tuesday morning in November. Rebecca had prepared a comprehensive package that included witness statements from 8 different victims, documentation of selective enforcement, copies of Sheriff Davidson's discriminatory social media posts, and a detailed timeline of harassment spanning 5 years. The complaint went to 3 different agencies simultaneously: the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Justice. Rebecca had explained that this multi-pronged approach would prevent any single agency from burying the complaint or passing it off to someone else. "The key is creating pressure from multiple directions," she had told me. "When federal agencies start asking questions, local officials suddenly become very interested in finding solutions." I did not have to wait long for Sheriff Davidson's response. 2 days after the complaint was filed, she showed up at my ranch again, but this time she was alone. No backup, no flashing lights, no dramatic show of force. Just one angry woman in a uniform, standing on my front porch with murder in her eyes. "You think you are pretty smart, do you not?" she said when I opened the door. "I think I am pretty tired of being harassed," I replied calmly. "Harassed?" she laughed, but it was a harsh, bitter sound. "You have no idea what harassment looks like, but you are about to find out." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It is a promise. You want to play games with me? Fine, let us play. But you better understand that I know this county like the back of my hand. I know every law, every regulation, every code violation. I know every judge, every prosecutor, every official who matters. You are nobody here. You are nothing." I could feel my heart pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "I am a tax-paying citizen who owns property in this county. I have the same rights as everyone else." "Rights?" She spat the word like it was poison. "You gave up your rights when you decided to come after me. You think filing complaints with some federal bureaucrats is going to protect you. You think they care about what happens in some small town in Montana. I think they care about civil rights violations and abuse of power. We will see about that." She leaned closer and I could smell the coffee on her breath. "You have made a very big mistake. This is my county, these are my people, and I do not lose." After she left, I called Rebecca immediately to report the encounter. She was not surprised. "Intimidation and retaliation are common in these cases," she said. "Make sure you document everything. Record conversations if you can. She is going to try to provoke you into doing something stupid." The retaliation began immediately. Within a week, I received citations for 3 different property violations: an allegedly loose fence post, grass that was supposedly too tall, and a mailbox that was positioned 2 inches closer to the road than county regulations allowed. Each citation carried a hefty fine and a court date. But Sheriff Davidson had made a critical error. In her anger and desperation to punish me, she had become careless. The property violations she cited were identical to conditions that existed on dozens of other properties throughout the county, properties owned by longtime residents who had never received citations. Rebecca and I documented every violation, took photographs of similar conditions on neighboring properties, and prepared a case that clearly demonstrated selective enforcement based on discriminatory intent. The State Attorney General's office sent investigators to interview me and several other victims. The FBI opened a formal civil rights investigation. Local media picked up the story, and suddenly Sheriff Davidson found herself facing scrutiny from multiple directions. The community response was mixed. Some longtime residents rallied around their sheriff, viewing the investigation as an attack on their way of life. But others, particularly newer residents and people who had been quietly suffering under Davidson's reign, began to speak out. "I have been waiting for someone to stand up to her for years," said Tom Bradley, a local business owner who had lived in the county for 15 years. "She thinks she owns this place, but she works for us. We hired her and we can fire her." The tension in the community was palpable. You could feel it in the grocery store, at the gas station, in casual conversations at the post office. People were choosing sides, and the battle lines were becoming clear. Sheriff Davidson still had her supporters, but for the first time in years, she also had serious opposition. The investigation was moving forward, and everyone knew that change was coming to the county. The only question was what form that change would take. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 6 weeks, federal agents had interviewed over 20 witnesses, reviewed hundreds of documents, and uncovered a pattern of misconduct that went far beyond simple harassment of outsiders. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Sheriff Davidson had been using her position to protect certain local businesses from regulatory oversight, while targeting their competitors with aggressive enforcement. She had been taking payments from a local construction company in exchange for ignoring building code violations, while simultaneously citing their competitors for minor infractions. "This is not just about discrimination," Rebecca explained to me during a phone call. "This is about corruption. She was running a protection racket." The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed suspicious cash deposits into Sheriff Davidson's personal accounts. Phone records documented conversations with business owners about arrangements and understandings. Most damaging of all, investigators found emails between Davidson and her deputy discussing how to discourage certain businesses from competing with their preferred contractors. The indictment came down on a cold January morning. Sheriff Karen Davidson was charged with civil rights violations, conspiracy, bribery, and abuse of power under color of law. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. I was in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise over my pasture, when Rebecca called with the news. "It is over," she said simply. "She has been arrested and suspended from duty pending trial." I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the nightmare was finally ending, but sadness that it had taken so long and hurt so many people. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page: "Sheriff arrested on federal charges." The article detailed the investigation and listed the names of victims who had come forward. I was mentioned prominently as the person who had initiated the complaint. The community response was immediate and divided. Some people were shocked and angry, insisting that Sheriff Davidson was being railroaded by federal bureaucrats who did not understand small-town life. Others expressed relief that someone had finally held her accountable. "Thank you," Sarah Chen said to me when we met at the post office. "I know this was not easy for you, but you gave all of us our lives back." The trial took place 6 months later. I testified about my experiences, as did 7 other victims. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence documenting years of systematic abuse and corruption. Sheriff Davidson's defense team tried to portray her as a dedicated public servant who had been misunderstood, but the evidence was too overwhelming. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The day of the sentencing, I sat in the courtroom and watched as the woman who had tried to drive me from my home was led away in handcuffs. I felt no joy in her downfall, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. After the trial, several people approached me to shake my hand and thank me for my courage. Tom Bradley, the business owner who had supported the investigation, was particularly emotional. "You saved this community," he said. "We had forgotten what it was like to live without fear. You reminded us that we do not have to accept abuse from anyone, even people in positions of authority." The county appointed an interim sheriff, a professional law enforcement officer from the state police, who immediately implemented new policies and procedures to prevent future abuse. Property citations that had been issued during Davidson's reign of terror were reviewed, and many were dismissed. The atmosphere in the community began to change, becoming more welcoming and less fearful. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people themselves. The investigation and trial had empowered citizens to speak up against injustice, to demand accountability from their elected officials, and to remember that in a democracy, those who serve in government work for the people, not the other way around. Sheriff Karen Davidson had spent 8 years trying to control and intimidate the community she was supposed to serve. In the end, her abuse of power had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of organized resistance she had worked so hard to prevent. The community was stronger now, more united, and more determined to protect the rights and dignity of all its residents, regardless of where they came from or how long they had lived there. 2 years have passed since Sheriff Davidson was led away in handcuffs, and my life has settled into the peaceful rhythm I had originally dreamed of when I bought the ranch. My mornings begin with coffee on the front porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains and listening to the creek babble through the back pasture. The sound of sirens no longer makes my heart race. The community has healed, though the scars remain visible to those who know where to look. The new sheriff, a thoughtful woman named Captain Rodriguez who transferred from the state police, has worked hard to rebuild trust between law enforcement and residents. She instituted community policing programs, established citizen review boards, and created clear policies for handling complaints about officer conduct. "Policing is about service, not power," she told me during a community meeting last year. "My job is to protect everyone in this county equally, regardless of where they came from or how long they have lived here." The changes go beyond law enforcement. The county commissioners passed new ordinances requiring transparency in government operations. Citizens now have better access to public records and more opportunities to participate in local decision-making. The culture of fear and intimidation that Sheriff Davidson had cultivated has been replaced by something healthier and more democratic. I have become more involved in community affairs than I ever expected. I serve on the County Planning Commission and volunteer with the local veterans group. The relationships I have built through shared struggle have grown into genuine friendships. Sarah Chen and I meet for coffee every Tuesday, and we often laugh about how we bonded over mutual harassment by a corrupt sheriff. "You know what I realized," Sarah said to me recently. "Davidson actually did us a favor. She brought us together. She forced us to find our courage and stand up for ourselves." The ranch has become everything I hoped it would be. I have expanded the property by purchasing adjacent land from Frank Morrison's nephew. I keep a small herd of cattle now, and I am learning to manage the pasture rotations and water systems. The work is hard but satisfying in a way that my city job never was. Sometimes I think about Sheriff Davidson, locked away in federal prison, and I wonder if she understands what she lost. She had a chance to serve her community with honor and integrity. Instead, she chose to abuse her power and bully the people she was supposed to protect. The irony is that her actions created exactly the kind of strong, united community that she claimed to want to preserve. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they decide to use it. Standing up to abuse and corruption is never easy, but it is always necessary. Democracy only works when citizens are willing to hold their leaders accountable, regardless of the personal cost. My dream of a peaceful life in the country eventually came true, but it came at a price I never expected to pay. The peace I enjoy now is deeper and more meaningful because it was earned through struggle and sacrifice. I know that it can be taken away if we become complacent, so I remain vigilant. After all, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and I have learned that lesson well.